Welcome to the Just Third Way podcast, where we ask the question, would you rather own or be owned? Brought to you by the Center for Economic and Social Justice at cesj.org. Hello, thanks for listening to the Just Third Way Hour podcast, number 11. I'm your host, Dave Hamill. I want to start by apologizing that I haven't put out a podcast in a little while. We're just kind of getting in the routine of doing one and working it into the busy schedule, and also we have to kind of streamline the process of deciding what we're going to do each week. But it is intended to be weekly, and I'm going to try to post a new one every week by Wednesday night or so. So if you want to check back later in the week, each week, like Thursday or Friday, then we should have another one for you each week. And today I'm going to go to the CESJ website and read something that I think is very important. It's an article called "What is Money?" And this is something that not only would, be good for anyone that listens regularly to hear, if they don't have time to sit down and read it on the website, but also to be able to forward it to friends and family, whoever is interested in our stuff, that can get it to them in an audio format. They can easily absorb the information. So I'm just going to read that article from the CESJ website. That's cesj.org, stands for Center for Economic and Social Justice.org. And you could just type in "what is money" in the search bar there, and this will come up. So here we go. What is money? Money and credit, and where they come from, are not as mysterious as most people think. To understand how money is created, however, we first have to ask, what is money? Most simply put, money is anything that can be accepted to satisfy a debt. In this way, money and credit are simply two sides of the same thing, a system of making promises and keeping those promises. As Black's Law Dictionary states, money is all things transferred in commerce. All money is therefore a contract, and in a sense, all contracts are money. Money can take many forms of how people exchange things they own. Money is based on and derived from the concept of private property, which is the right to the fruits and control over what a person owns. Money is therefore a social good, an artifact of civilization invented to facilitate economic transactions. Like any social good, money can be used justly or unjustly. It can be used by those who control it to suppress the independence and human potential of the many, or to achieve economic liberation and universal prosperity by financing capital ownership for every citizen. Most economists will explain that money is 1. The medium of exchange, 2. A store of value, 3. A standard of value, and 4. A common measure of value. Only the first two of these, however, apply to all money. The other two describe currency, current money, and really say the same thing. A commonly recognized determination of value, often regulated, but need not be created by government. Making things a little more clear, lawyer-economist Louis Kelso delved further into the nature of money. His concern was the impact of contracts and property on the economic system, which is reasonable, as money is ultimately a system of contracts for the exchange of property rights. Money is not a part of the visible sector of the economy, he said. People do not consume money. Money is not a physical factor of production, but rather a yardstick for measuring economic input, economic outtake, and the relative values of the real goods and services of the economic world. Money provides a method of measuring obligations, rights, powers, and privileges. It provides a means whereby certain individuals can accumulate claims against others, or against the economy as a whole, or against many economies. It's a system of symbols that many economists substitute for the visible sector and its productive enterprises, goods and services, thereby losing sight of the fact that a monetary system is a part only of the invisible sector of the economy, and that its adequacy can be measured by its effect upon the visible sector. And that quote is from Louis Kelso and Patricia Hetter in the Two-Factor Theory, The Economics of Reality, a book from, it's like 1967. So, creating money using a commercial and central banking system such as the U.S. Federal Reserve System is not supposed to be a secret guarded by high priests. The system was designed to allow money to be created or canceled as needed by the economy. That way there would never be too little money, resulting in deflation, or too much, causing inflation. The House Banking and Currency Committee, in its widely circulated publication, A Primer on Money, in August of '64, noted, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, Congress intended the purchase of eligible paper by issuing promissory notes to be the main way that the Federal Reserve System would create bank reserves. When this practice was followed, the banks in a particular area could obtain loanable funds in direct proportion to the community's needs for money. But in recent years, i.e. from 1933 to 1964, the Federal Reserve has purchased almost no eligible paper. When the Federal Reserve System was set up in 1914, the money supply was expected to grow with the needs of the economy. It was hoped that by monetizing eligible short-term commercial paper, by providing liquidity to sound banks in periods of stress, and by restraining excessive credit expansion, the banking system could be guided automatically toward the provision of an adequate and stable money supply to meet the needs of industry and commerce, to safeguard their liquidity and provide a base for expansion. The member banks could obtain credit from the nearest Federal Reserve Bank, usually by rediscounting their eligible paper at the bank, i.e. selling to the Reserve Bank certain loan paper representing loans which the member bank had made to its own customers, the requirements for eligibility being defined by law. If necessary, the member banks might also obtain reserves by getting advances from the Federal Reserve Bank. In other words, under a central banking system as originally designed, businesses or other productive enterprises would obtain loans at their local commercial bank, a process called discounting. The commercial bank, in a process known as rediscounting, would then sell the qualified loan paper of the business enterprises to the central bank. This would create an elastic, asset-backed reserve currency to stabilize the economy. As a social tool, however, the money creation powers of the central bank are like the vote. They can be used to keep an elite in power, or they can spread power around by financing capital formation and acquisition by every person by creating money to purchase assets that pay for themselves out of their own future profits. Once the assets are paid for, the stream of profits provides the owners an ongoing source of income to help meet consumption needs such as food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and education. The Center for Economic and Social Justice, CESJ, has proposed capital homesteading, an application of principles CESJ calls the just third way, to reform the financial system so that it works to the advantage of everyone, not just a few. The world, as R. Buckminster Fuller suggested, can work for 100% of humanity. Under this program, every child, woman, and man, capital homesteaders, would have an equal right to purchase on credit newly issued equity shares that give the vote and receive all profits earned on the shares. This amount would be the same for everyone, rich or poor. It is important to note, however, that no new money would be created until the shares a homesteader wants to buy have been approved by the lender and deemed a good risk by a capital credit insurer. A commercial bank would accept a contract for a loan, paper, from a homesteader, buying it by issuing a promissory note. The bank would then immediately sell its paper to one of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The Federal Reserve would issue its own promissory notes to back newly printed currency or new demand deposits that would be handed over to the homesteader to purchase the shares he or she wants to buy. When the shares pay dividends, the homesteader would use the dividends first to repay the loan used to acquire the shares. The Federal Reserve would cancel the money, thereby avoiding inflation. The homesteader would then have dividend income to use for consumption needs. More about this can be found on the CESJ website under the heading Capital Homesteading. In this way, the Federal Reserve System would create an asset-backed currency that increased or decreased as the need for money increased or decreased, avoiding deflation or inflation. At the same time, it would rapidly increase the number of capital owners in the country while decreasing the wealth and income gap. It would also decrease the role of the state in taking care of people as they're able to take care of themselves. As the loans were repaid, the currency would be taken out of circulation or the demand deposits erased from the books. This would remove money from the economy that was not linked directly to hard assets. Although no actual teller's window exists where commercial banks stand in line to sell loan paper to the Federal Reserve, the transaction is described as taking place at the discount window. The process is actually rediscounting, but it's called the discount window. When the discount window is open, commercial banks can sell their qualified industrial, commercial, and agricultural paper to the central bank. When the discount window is closed, commercial banks must go elsewhere to obtain excess reserves to lend or cease making loans. Thus, the establishment of the Federal Reserve really did have the potential to become an economic 4th of July, assuming the economy grows faster in ways that every citizen can earn more wages and profits to purchase what the economy can produce. Without that, the social good of money and credit will keep being used to make the rich richer and keep the non-rich propertyless and powerless. Now I'm going to read from the website the Capital Homestead Act Summary. The Capital Homestead Act is a comprehensive national economic strategy for empowering every American citizen, including the poorest of the poor, with the means to acquire, control, and enjoy the fruits of productive corporate assets. This long-range agenda involves major restructuring of our tax system and our Federal Reserve policies to lift unjust artificial barriers to more equitable distribution of future corporate capital and faster growth rates of private sector investment. It would shift primary national income maintenance policies from inflationary wage and unproductive income redistribution expedients to market-based ownership sharing and dividend incomes. The Capital Homestead Act's central focus is the democratization of capital, productive credit. By universalizing citizen access to direct capital ownership through access to interest-free productive credit, it would close the power and opportunity gap between today's haves and have-nots without taking away property from today's owners. Goals of the Capital Homestead Act. As summarized below, the Capital Homestead Act is designed to 1. Generate millions of new private sector jobs by lifting ownership concentrating Federal Reserve credit barriers in order to accelerate private sector growth linked to expanded ownership opportunities at a zero rate of inflation. 2. Radically overhaul and simplify the federal tax system to eliminate budget deficits and ownership concentrating tax barriers through a single rate tax on all individual incomes from all sources above basic subsistence levels. Its tax reforms would A. Eliminate payroll taxes on working Americans and their employers. B. Integrate corporate and personal income taxes. And C. Exempt from taxation the basic incomes of all citizens up to a level that allows them to meet their own subsistence needs and living expenses while providing safety net vouchers for the poor. 3. Restructure inheritance and gift taxes, death taxes, to discourage transfers from one generation to the next of excessive concentrations of wealth, i.e., when the income generated by one's capital far outstrips one's capacity to consume the goods and services of others, and where one's unconsumed income is simply reinvested in more capital acquisitions, resulting eventually in the monopolization of future capital ownership opportunities by the already wealthy. In order to promote individual initiative, capital self-sufficiency, and limited economic power of the state, inheritance policy should encourage the broadest possible distribution of private property ownership in income-producing assets. There's a graphic here that shows capital homesteading vehicles for ownership democratization. Those include employee stock ownership plan for corporate employees, capital homestead account for every citizen, citizens land bank for residents, and consumer stock ownership plan for utility customers. And some of those have changed slightly in their name, but they are the four main vehicles. The Capital Homestead Account, or CHA, is the primary tax-sheltered vehicle for the democratization of capital credit through local banks. It would enable every man, woman, and child to accumulate wealth and receive dividend incomes from newly issued shares in new and growing companies without being taxed on the accumulations, including property and shares gained through inheritance, savings, and arrangements like ESOPs, CSOPs, and CLBs. In addition to serving as a source of capital credit for corporate workers, CHAs would also provide an ownership-building account for individuals who do not work for profit-making enterprises, such as school teachers, civil servants, military personnel, police and health workers, and for individuals who have no remunerative employment, such as the disabled, the unemployed, homemakers, and children. The Citizens Land Bank, or CLB, known as the For-Profit Citizens Land Cooperative or Community Investment Corporation, allows residents of a community to share in the control and profits associated with land planning and development. The CLB would encourage governments at all levels, from the community to the highest government level, as well as nonprofit entities, to distribute the ownership of land and natural resources free to all citizens. This would encourage citizens to participate in development so they can share in planning, governance, and lease incomes from the use of land and natural resources. Boy, that would be better. Little commentary, that would be better as far as those grazing lands that go out west. I hadn't thought about that before, but if the local people actually owned it and had a voting say. Anyway, the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, or ESOP, channels low-cost credit for financing the needs of business corporations, such as expansion, capitalization, and ownership transfers, and links to private sector workers to ownership shares and dividend incomes in the companies for which they work. Shares acquired on credit by worker owners are paid for out of the future corporate profits they help to generate. The Consumer or Customer Stock Ownership Plan, CSOP, lets the customers of utilities share in the governance and profitability of natural monopolies like telecommunications, water and power companies, mass transit, and cable television. Policy objectives of capital homesteading. To meet Social Security and Medicare entitlements and provide for their eventual phasing out as the mainstay of retirement income for most Americans, and to shift the federal government's role from today's income redistribution policies to the more limited and healthy role of encouraging economic justice through free enterprise growth, a capital homestead program would promote private sector growth linked to broaden ownership, recreate in the 21st century the conditions that resulted from the first Homestead Act of 1862, including full employment, declining prices, and widespread individual and effective ownership of income-generating assets. Set a realistic long-term target based on the nation's industrial growth potential to achieve a minimum capital homestead stake for every family. As an initial measure, this could be geared conservatively toward an equity accumulation of, for example, $150,000 over the next 20 years. Stimulate maximum growth with a balanced budget and zero inflation rate. Remove barriers to maximum rates of sustainable, environmentally sound private sector growth to achieve a balanced federal budget and a zero inflation rate under the Capital Homestead Program. Establish a tax system that stimulates economic growth and jobs and is more accountable to taxpayers. Rewrite and radically simplify the existing federal tax system to automatically balance the budget. Keep more money in the pockets of taxpayers from their initial earnings to cover their own health, education, housing, and other basic household living expenses. Make Congress more directly accountable and responsive to all taxpayers. Eliminate all tax provisions, personal deductions, tax credits, and exemptions, except for the front-end exemptions for adults and dependents, that unjustly discriminate against or discourage property accumulations and investment incomes for poor and non-rich families. For example, a single tax rate on all sources of labor or capital income over exemptions would be automatically set to meet all federal entitlement and other programs and to pay down past deficits. To meet personal living costs, the basic incomes of all taxpayers up to $30,000 per adult and $20,000 per dependent, or $100,000 for a family of 4, would be free from any income or payroll taxes. To increase taxable income for all citizens, corporations could escape from the multiple tax on corporate incomes by deducting dividend payouts. Keep Social Security and Medicare promises. Keep existing promises and reduce the unsustainable burden on the Social Security and Medicare systems by enabling every American to accumulate sufficient wealth-producing assets to provide each person with an adequate and secure taxable income from property, independent of Social Security and Medicare benefits and incomes from other sources. Based on conservative projections of U.S. growth potential, by age 65, a child born today could accumulate a capital estate of nearly $500,000, generating $1.6 million in after-tax dividends over that period. Inheritance and gift tax reforms. To create a more just and balanced free market economy and discourage monopolies, super-rich individuals should be encouraged to democratize their enormous accumulations from one generation to another. Gift and estate taxes should not be imposed on the donor or his estate. Rather, taxation should be based on the size of the recipient's total accumulation after receiving the gift or bequest. If the value of the recipient's asset accumulations, other than one's primary home, after receiving the gift or bequest, makes the recipient richer than, for example, $1 million, the recipient would pay a gift tax on the excess accumulations. Restructure the credit and tax systems to encourage universal health care through the private sector. Capital homestead reforms, supplemented by health care vouchers for the poor, would provide a sustainable way to finance the health care system. These reforms would empower each citizen and family with the means to enjoy and pay for affordable, quality health coverage of their choice. Through market-disciplined, comprehensive health care enterprises that are owned and controlled by health care providers and health care subscribers, patients, the doctor-patient relationship could be restored while providing greater insurance portability, accountability, and lower administrative overhead costs through the system. Solve the home foreclosure crisis and make home ownership accessible to all citizens. Starting in communities with homes whose market values are deflated due to the subprime mortgage crisis, resident-owned homeowners equity corporations, HECs, could receive interest-free credit to buy up the foreclosed properties. As occupants of the homes in default pay the HEC their monthly rents, which could be supplemented with housing vouchers for the poor, these would be applied toward debt service using pre-tax dollars to pay off the loans that the HEC used to purchase the foreclosed properties. As they make their regular monthly lease payments, these renters would become full owners of HEC shares and their dwellings. Stop Federal Reserve monetization of government debt. Terminate use of the Federal Reserve's powers to create debt-backed money to support foreign currencies or to buy and sell primary or secondary treasury securities. This would reduce excessive government spending and improve accountability. It would force government to borrow for deficits directly from savers in the open markets. Stabilize the value of the currency. Require the Federal Reserve to create a stable, asset-backed currency to encourage ownership by all citizens of productive private sector assets rather than non-productive public sector debt or future ownership monopolies. Reduce dependency on past savings for financing growth. Require the Federal Reserve to distinguish between productive and non-productive use of credit by providing interest-free money to expand bank credit to enable every American to become an owner of a viable accumulation of new income-producing assets. This would reduce America's dependency on past savings, corporate retained earnings, or foreign government wealth funds advantaged by America's growing trade imbalances. Require the Federal Reserve System to supply sufficient money and credit through local banks to meet the liquidity and broadened ownership needs of an expanding market-disciplined economy. Such Fed-monetized loans would be subject to appropriate feasibility standards administered by the banks and limited only by the goal of maintaining a stable value for the dollar. Unsound uses of credit, such as the speculative credit that created subprime home mortgages and the global financial meltdown, would be financed from the accumulations of those wealthy Americans and foreigners who could afford the risks. Democratize ownership of the Federal Reserve. Provide every citizen a single lifetime non-transferable voting share in the nation's central bank and in one of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. This will ensure that the Fed's Board of Governors is broadly representative of all groups affected by Fed policy, and that power over future money creation is spread widely among all citizens. Discourage monopolies and monopolistic ownership. Link all economic reforms to methods that discourage privileged access to monopolistic accumulations of private property ownership of the means of production. Enforce antitrust laws by providing access to interest-free capital credit to encourage broadly owned new competitors to enhance and sustain market-oriented growth. Introduce a market-driven wage and price system. Gradually eliminate rigid, artificially protected wage and price levels and other restrictions on free trade that afford special privileges to some industries, businesses, and workers at the expense of American and foreign customers of U.S. products. Replace subsidies with interest-free credit incentives to farmers who wish to associate voluntarily in cooperatives and in enterprises jointly owned by farmers and workers, including integrated agribusinesses. The income generated by farmer-owned enterprises would supplement farm incomes and reduce the need for subsidies. Restore property rights in corporate equity. Restore the original rights of private property to all owners of corporate equity, particularly with respect to the right to profits and in the sharing of control over corporate policies. Preserve traditional powers of professional managers held accountable by justice-based management corporate governance structures. Offer a more just social contract for workers. A top priority during the next decade would be developing a more just social contract for persons employed in the private sector. This would be geared toward establishing maximum ownership incentives. Instead of inflationary wage system increases, employees would begin to earn future increases in income through production bonuses, equity accumulations, and profit earnings. These bottom-line rewards would be linked to workers' individual contributions and to the productivity and success of their work team and the enterprise for which they work. Encourage more harmonious worker-management relations. Promote the right of non-management workers to form democratic unions and other voluntary associations. Instead of promoting the traditional conflict model of industrial relations, however, labor unions would be encouraged to transform themselves into democratic ownership unions. These ownership unions could become society's primary institutions for promoting a free market version of economic justice, while continuing to negotiate and advance workers' economic interests, including worker ownership rights and justice-based management policies. Under capital homesteading, unions could expand their role in a free market system by educating and expanding their membership to include all citizen shareholders. Ownership unions would enhance the property rights of all shareholders by enhancing management accountability and transparency, and protecting against unjust executive compensation schemes. Promote a life-enhancing physical and cultural environment. Encourage special ownership incentives for those engaged in research and development, especially in the search for new and sustainable sources of energy, ecological restoration, and labor-saving technologies. Provide sufficient low-cost credit and royalty-free licensing for enterprises capable of commercializing life-enhancing technologies developed for the military and space programs. Subsidize the development of new methods of conserving and recycling non-replenishable and limited natural resources that are vital to civilization's long-term survival, at least until suitable substitutes can be discovered and developed. Promote the teaching at all levels of education of universal principles of personal morality and social morality that are based on the inherent dignity and sovereignty of every human person within all institutions of a just social order, including the state. Reduce public sector costs. Provide America's military, policemen, and firemen, teachers, and other public sector workers with a growing and more direct equity stake in the free enterprise system, both as a supplement to their costly pension plans and so that they will better understand and defend the institution of private property. Whenever feasible, transform government-owned enterprises and services into competitive private sector companies by offering their workers and customers and other stakeholders in capital-intensive operations like TVA opportunities to participate in ownership, governance, and profits. Establish workable demonstrations of capital homesteading at the community, state, regional, and global levels. Launch several capital homesteading demonstrations. These would be most effective in areas of high unemployment, such as the for-profit Citizens Land Bank now being proposed in Cleveland, Ohio, Harris Neck, Georgia, and East St. Louis, Illinois. Similar projects could be developed on Native American reservations. A major objective would be to evaluate ownership-broadening Federal Reserve reforms, innovative broadening ownership mechanisms, advance concepts of worker participation in decision-making, and servant leadership developments like justice-based management. Encourage state and local governments in other countries to promote widespread capital ownership as a basic just third way framework for building a sound market economy. Study the feasibility of a national and global citizen-owned land and natural resources bank to plan development of nature's resources, receive rentals for use of land and natural resources, and distribute citizen dividends among the population. With the leadership of the United States, urge the United Nations and other international agencies to encourage the use of such economic development vehicles in order to bring about peace through justice in such conflict-torn countries as Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Sudan, Kashmir, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, Burma, Sri Lanka, etc. Such an approach could provide a model Abraham Federation solution for resolving the conflict between the Palestinians and Israelis. Initiate new challenges for multinationals. Provide special encouragement to U.S.-based multinational corporations and global financial institutions to become instruments of peace and a more just world economic order by broadening access to their ownership base to all citizens of the world community. Encourage businesses to open up future ownership opportunities as they begin harnessing the resources of the sea, the airways, and other planets. Promote a new global monetary system. Encourage the convening of a second Bretton Woods conference to consider the implications of the Kelsonian binary economic model on global currency standards, the feasibility of a single global currency, and more just foreign exchange rates. The new policy should seek to reform global financial markets to address the challenge of global poverty and sustainable development, as well as leveling the playing field among nations for global free and open trade. So that's the end of that page, that article. It does say at the bottom, for more detail on capital homesteading reforms, see the book, Capital Homesteading for Every Citizen, a Just Free Market Solution for Saving Social Security by Norman G. Curlin, Dawn K. Brohon, and Michael D. Greeny, published by Economic Justice Media 2004. So that wraps up today's podcast. We covered a lot of obviously detailed stuff. It's not really exciting to listen to it all at once, but it is good to have it in a block of information that you can forward around. I just want to say I have given this material to friends and relatives sometimes, and they'll pick out one or two things that they disagree with. And, you know, I don't know that any single person could write, you know, such a plan and have it exactly the same. I mean, if I had written it, it might be a little different here and there, and, you know, I might disagree with one or two things. But I agree so much with the gist of it, and I hope that other people who agree with the gist of it would sort of set aside their differences, because you can always lobby for small changes in a plan, but you have to have a plan, and you have to have candidates and leaders who put forth a plan. And I support anyone that is in favor of a capital homesteading reform scenario. So if they have some small details as part of what they want that are different from how I would do it, I would not care at all. It's, you know, such a drastic improvement to the status quo that I can certainly put up with a few differences of opinion and run things slightly different from how I would. I just happen to think of that near the end there because it mentions the possibility of a global currency. And I do have some friends who are totally against the concept of a global currency, but I would think that they could see the benefit of every other part of the proposal and get involved and work to say that they think there should not be a global currency. You know, that's just one small example, but I don't think anyone at CESJ would say, no, we're not going to have capital homesteading unless we could have a global currency, or, you know, we're not going to have the Federal Reserve reforms if we can't get, you know, one specific aspect of the tax plan passed. And unfortunately, that's how things do happen in policy making. You have small compromises here and there. So anyway, I just wanted to say that because I like for people to come together in general over the overall focus of, you know, widespread ownership of productive capital and people being involved in decision making of institutions that affect their lives and things like that without, you know, getting hung up on one small detail here or there. So that's a little bit of my own philosophy thrown in there. I just thought of that, and would love to discuss any specific aspect of these plans with anyone. But I guess that's it. So shoot me an email if you have any comments or questions. rdhamill@gmail.com. That's rdhamill@gmail.com. And own or be owned. We'll talk to you next week.